Alright, so this is kind of a preface to the disclaimer, a disclaimer on the disclaimer. What I want to talk about here up at the top is, again, somewhat of a disclaimer on the disclaimer that I'm going to kick the video off with. Because after I recorded this last night, because this is the next day, different hair, different shirt, I was talking it over with my friends because they were curious about the next video that I was going to put up. And I was explaining that this video is going to be about Hama from Avatar: The Last Airbender and representation of Indigenous rage and response to generational trauma from colonialism, and how that factors into my reading of Hama being portrayed as a caricature of that subject. And my friends got me thinking that my issue is not with the creators fully, totally themselves, as though I'm putting the flaws squarely on their shoulders. My issue with painting Avatar: The Last Airbender as a perfect portrayal of the evils of colonialism and imperialism mainly stems from the way people in the ATLA fandom are consuming and critically analyzing this media. The creators put forth this idea that it is a critique of colonialism and imperialism, but not the critique of colonialism and imperialism, which I can admit, it doesn't have to be perfect. It could be better, but they never claimed that it was going to be this perfect one-to-one thing. But the ATLA fandom has done this thing where they decided to put the series up on a pedestal because it is part of this generational zeitgeist that, everybody grew up with this. We grew up talking about it. We grew up watching it every day kind of thing. And then whenever someone criticizes the way that those themes are presented, they claim that there was no other way that they could have done it, and that the person being critical is just asking way too much of the series. And I disagree, frankly, because one other way it could have been done is to have Indigenous people, especially Inuit, in the room when it came to sitting down to construct the narrative surrounding Hama and how she deals with her trauma. Instead, Hama's character became an unfairly negative portrayal that exaggerated the ways in which people can respond to periods of intense trauma, especially when it comes to colonialism and imperialism and her having been captured and tortured by the Fire Nation as a waterbender from the Southern Water Tribe. It really makes it seem like the negative portrayal that exaggerated the ways in which people can respond to these periods makes it seem as though she's an irredeemable villain rather than a sympathetic, damaged person who has done bad things the way she actually is. In my opinion, it would have created a more inviting space for a dialogue between Hama and Katara about the anger response of trauma if they had instead taken a more realistic approach to the way Hama treated Fire Nation settlers in her village. Because what my friend suggested to me is that characters like Hama and Jet and other characters that Katara meets through the course of the series are less about this being a representation of a real person and more about a narrative tool that is helping Katara explore these negative emotions surrounding vengeance and anger and rage. And, I agree with that reading. I get that. But when it comes to, I guess, the way that I was reading it, which is what I'm going to go into in the rest of the video, it would have made more sense for them to take a little bit more of a realistic approach that was not so heavily leaning into the idea that, anger is inherently violent and that to be angry at one's oppressors is inherently bad. It makes you as bad as the oppressor. It would not have been so heavy-handed, and it wouldn't have been putting forth this toxic message of don't ask, don't tell when it comes to trauma and the way that certain things in the aftermath of colonialism and imperialism make Indigenous people feel. So when I say that Hama is an exaggerated portrayal or that she's a caricature, that's what I'm talking about. The fact that this representation leans so far into what she had been doing as extreme and violent and wrong that it ended up creating the message that no one should be angry about colonialism or imperialism, or that there's a certain way that you need to be angry. There's a certain way that you need to process, or else you are as bad as the oppressor. And a lot of people that I see repeating and spreading that in the fandom are white fans who really need to decolonize their media critique and critical analysis skills. I'm not going to say it's 100% the creators or the production team themselves, because, that's not very fair. As far as ratio goes, I'm going to say it's 60-40 production fandom. That's my opinion. Anyway, back to the beginning. Hi everyone. Today's video is going to be about reading the representation of Indigenous people through the character Hama in the series Avatar: The Last Airbender. So first, the roadmap. I'm going to go over a general disclaimer that I'm going to be using for the rest of the videos I make about characters or themes and, narrative arcs regarding Avatar: The Last Airbender. Then I'm going to talk about Hamas Past as presented in the television series, The Present, which is like the actual episode that she's in, that timeline. The dynamic between her and Katara, as well as the Colonial Gaze and the way that other Indigenous characters as a whole are represented in this series. I'm also going to go over a hot take that I saw over the summer when Netflix had put up all 4 seasons, and then when announcements for the new live-action movie were being made, because they were just so terrible, I feel like I need to address them. And then we're going to do a wrap-up and a section for final thoughts. So throwing it back to the preface, a Tibetan Tumblr user wrote a lengthy post about how even though a lot of representation in the show is meant to bring some kind of awareness to colonialism and imperialism and the violence that those two things bring, it ends up being pretty ham-fisted and poorly executed. And in that respect, I think talking about Hama and the lens that she is written with speaks to that person's point, because to me there was a very deep disconnect between the way Hama's character is written and the supposed intent of discussing the actual after effects of colonialism and how that manifests generation after generation. I'm also going to be using that post to inform my reading of Hama, as well as other critical analysis posts that were getting passed around on the internet, in order to flesh out why exactly the reading of Avatar: The Last Airbender is a critique of colonialism and imperialism can be flawed, because when the spotlight is on the story of an Indigenous person and the way that they cope with the trauma caused by colonialism and imperialism, there are a lot of foundational issues in that story because of the lens that it is being told with and the person who is doing the retelling. The past and present breakdown are essentially just a rundown of the episode in broad strokes, because this is one of the only, if not the only, episode that Hama appears in. Hama's past before the episode actually takes place, like within the larger narrative of the Avatar: The Last Airbender timeline, is presented to us as this. Hama came from the Southern Water Tribe and was friends with Katara's grandmother and was one of the waterbenders that lived there. And it seems to me that this is supposed to represent a thriving Indigenous population, and the instance of colonial violence that people read from the series takes place after that. And then, when the Fire Nation attacked the Southern Water Tribe, Hama was captured and imprisoned. And while she was imprisoned, she discovered that as a waterbender, she can bend the water inside of living things on the night of the full moon, because that is when waterbenders are at their most powerful. She then used this skill in order to escape from prison by manipulating the body of the guard and forcing him to unlock her cell. She then moved to a Fire Nation village and became an innkeeper, but lived with a lingering anger toward the Fire Nation. And on the night of the full moon, she kidnaps villagers and forces them to walk up a mountain to imprison them. The only person who escaped was a man named Ding, who escaped when the rising sun caused Hama to lose her bloodbending ability. Hama's present during the episode is presented to us as this. She overhears Katara telling a story about a girl from her village named Nini and invites them to stay at her inn. She warns them about the woods because of the kidnappings that have been taking place in the village. Sokka starts to question her behavior and starts looking around her home, which then causes her to reveal a water tribe comb, and then tells them more about herself, being in prison, life in the Southern Water Tribe, but then she leaves out the details around her escape. She then teaches Katara more waterbending techniques, like pulling water out of thin air, and talks about water being in unexpected places, which is admittedly little cryptic. And then she makes an example by pulling water out of a patch of fire lilies, leaving this giant crater of dead flowers around them. Katara then starts putting 2 and 2 together about Hama's cryptic statements and about waterbending and the missing villagers. The same night, Hama tries to teach Katara bloodbending, and Katara objects. Hama's position is that they must take vengeance on the Fire Nation for the destruction of their culture, saying that the Fire Nation deserves to be treated the way that she was treated. Katara then vows that she will keep Hama from kidnapping and torturing any more villagers. They fight, since she has learned the true nature of her identity and her intent. And then Hama is imprisoned by the townspeople after Toph frees them from the makeshift prison. Then Katara regrets having used bloodbending in order to beat Hama in combat. So there's that ethical, moral quandary of means to an end and stuff like that. So, regarding the relationship between Hama and Katara, I disagree with the narrative surrounding Hama's anger. The fact that she's imprisoned for no reason other than being a waterbender and part of the Water Tribe gives her every right to really be angry at the overarching system of power that the Fire Nation holds on almost every territory on the map. But the thing that really gets me is that Hama is never allowed to heal from it. When she escaped from prison, she had to hold on to that pain or else she would be put back in prison. And her feelings of her anger and the act of lashing out has less to do with just a blind hatred of individual Fire Nation citizens, and more to do with having access to the healing process that was taken away from her. The thing that I'm really seeing in the scene where she's teaching Katara how to bloodbend and there's that big crater of dead fire lilies, it presents a dichotomy where Hama expresses that when you are in dire straits, like being imprisoned and oppressed by the Fire Nation, as she was, you have to take water where you can find it. Katara feels that by extracting water from something like a living thing, it destroys the thing. This position that Hama and Katara have against one another ethically makes Hama appear much more destructive and hateful, and Katara appear as though what she wants is, peace and love kind of philosophy. Hama's success in getting Katara to bloodbend makes me feel that because of the established ethical dichotomy, Katara using bloodbending is presenting like a moral failure on her part. She feels shame for doing what is necessary in order to protect her friends and the townspeople, even though that is exactly the circumstances under which Hama had to learn about bloodbending in the first place. This presents an emotional or aggressive response to immediate violence or danger as a wrong, and that as a victim, your response must be always metered and logical, or else you are the true loser. So stepping away from the micro and into the macro, when the creators say that the series is supposed to represent colonial violence and its impact, the treatment of Hama and her proximity to that violence is transformed into what two white men think that Indigenous people's response to colonial violence should be, rather than a reflection of what it actually is. It's an intentional exaggeration of the anger response regarding Indigenous people's generational trauma and the way in which we are forced to walk through these systems that are inherently meant to oppress us in the wake of settler colonialism. Hama is treated as though her anger towards the Fire Nation for the almost total genocide of the Southern Water Tribe, the imprisonment of community members that hold a vital cultural resource, and the necessity for her to adopt a completely different identity in order to survive is somehow unfounded, and Katara is presented as morally better for hiding her anger where it cannot be seen or heard. Politically speaking, the idea that Hama is not allowed to externalize her anger, and that Katara is in a morally superior position because she never talks about it, is incredibly neoliberal and annoying. The Water Tribe is, according to the creators of the show, a representation of Inuit culture. Therefore, why then make a series about the evils of colonialism and genocide and imperialism, and then include this exaggerated portrait of anger these people may feel toward their very real oppressors? It makes me think that this narrative is echoing the noble savage trope, wherein Katara is morally and ethically correct and therefore superior, for representing the other end of the spectrum of trauma response, which is never talking about it, never acting on any emotion, and actively telling others who do that they are hindering the collective healing process. I hate this. So let's talk about why. So now I want to talk about the colonial gaze and how it manifests within the universe of Avatar: The Last Airbender, especially in regard to the Water Nation or the Water Tribe, because this is supposedly a not a one-to-one representation, but a sympathetic representation, as the creators have said, of Inuit living in the Arctic Circle. So the thing is that the colonial gaze is inherently the way that a person views a narrative, the way that they write a narrative, the way that they shape a narrative, being inherently linked to the tenets of colonialism, upholding colonialism, portraying colonialism in a very positive way, things like that. So what I felt that this does within the narrative universe of this show is that it completely changes the idea that the series is about the horrors of colonialism, because it then becomes a narrative through this one episode in which there is only one way that Indigenous people can deal with the trauma that results from colonial violence, and by allowing the unhealed wounds you sustain to affect you in any way, you then become as bad as the oppressor. If Indigenous people were in the room where this happened, the narrative could have become a critique of access to culturally intuitive healing for people who are experiencing the trauma of colonialism, or rather I should say the after effects of colonialism, which is then manifesting as generational trauma. And the importance of decolonization as well, but when two white people write this story, it becomes a very harsh criticism of Indigenous people and our response to intense pain caused on a systemic and institutional level, which white people don't have the authority or the right to do. Critiques of colonialism and imperialism can be done by white people, but they can't do that work by informing it with their personal opinion of how Indigenous people should have responded to it. Arguments like, it happened so long ago, eventually arise because Indigenous people should just let go of their anger, and it becomes a very slippery slope into, it wasn't that bad, so quickly. Because the Water Tribe is heavily based on Inuit living in Arctic Circle communities, like the polar extremes, kind of, which the creators have stated multiple times, this criticism that they're doing is performed with a palpable distance from the movement to decolonize, and very far from how real people are responding to the generational trauma caused by colonialism that they're basing this Water Tribe culture around. And you can't create a representation of real people on TV and then make judgments based on their lives based on a one-off character, as though that settles the debate around whether or not they are allowed to feel certain emotions and how strongly they are allowed to feel them. The fact that Hama is a one-off character and this criticism is passed off onto the Inuit community makes their intent more like performative allyship that is fine with co-opting the existence of Indigenous people and our pain, but then pathologizes the way that we feel that pain and the way that we respond to it and the way that we need to heal from it. Other people within the fandom have expressed similar sentiments, especially one that reads, if ATLA was written by Native people, Hama would have had a happy ending because she is an elder who has been through a lot, and hating her is something for white people. And frankly, I'm inclined to agree. Other people within the fandom have responded, if we're here to redeem Iroh on his past wrongdoings, then why is it that a clearly traumatized Native elder is considered pure evil? And I'm inclined to agree with that as well. Her continuing to bloodbend and kidnap the villagers is posited as a critique of her anger, rather than as a critique of the system that did not allow her to heal, which is then destroying her integrity as a character and makes her dangerous. And I'm echoing this person when I say, why is it accepted as fandom's general consensus that Iroh is the harmless old uncle, despite the fact that he was at the head of a 600-day siege on the city of Ba Sing Se that has clearly had a substantial impact on the entire Earth nation. He spent over 2 years shelling and attacking the city, resulting in countless tragedies, and yet he is the one we are claiming as the sweet, harmless uncle. Y'all need better standards. Get into this absolutely cold, ice cold, so cold it would actually burn you if you touched it kind of hot take. And that is that it is Hama's fault that Kaya, Katara's mother, is dead. So this Tumblr user decided to show their nasty, unwashed ass and make this claim that the Fire Nation was trying to exterminate waterbenders in response to Hama's escape from prison using bloodbending. Their theory sets up a timeline in which the raid on the southern tribe that ends in the death of Katara's mother takes place after Hama's escape from prison, forcing Kaya to take responsibility of claiming that she is the last waterbender in the southern tribe, which supposedly ultimately makes Hama responsible for her death. I simply don't buy it, because within this theory, when paralleling the creator's intention to display the evils of colonialism and imperialism and the Water Tribe and Inuit, you are basically blaming indigenous people for our own oppression and for our own deaths at the hands of colonizers. It goes along the lines of saying if you were nicer to your oppressors, they wouldn't oppress you, which, as we know, like, it's just common knowledge that it's a fundamentally flawed concept. It also places the entire burden of an attempted genocide of the Southern Water Tribe solely on Hama's shoulders, which completely erases the responsibility that the Fire Nation has to bear for that action, because they very clearly did this. This theory just can't exist in a vacuum, because the way that the original poster is claiming that there are other structural elements to the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender that create that vacuum, you just can't get on board with the idea that the creators have used the Fire Nation as a vehicle for critiquing and colonizing and imperialism, and at the same time utilize one individual's action to combat it, to justify the acts that constitute colonialism and imperialism. On that basis, the theory can't hold water, because it cannot be used to critically analyze Hama or her narrative, because it just isn't relevant. It just doesn't make any sense. It would make far more sense for this person to have said the Fire Nation engaged in this act because fire and water are directly opposite elements, which means that waterbenders in either the southern or the northern tribe were more a threat to their power than just regular people living regular lives within what we know as the Water Tribe. I don't know. I don't know where people turn around and they type this out, or for lack of a better phrase, shit this out on a computer, and then put this on the internet and expect to think that they've done something. And then for that post to have so many notes as though those same people are not talking about how colonialism and imperialism and its critique are a foundational part of this series, it boggles my mind a little bit how those two things can exist in these people's minds side by side, because one is inherently refuting the existence of the other. Anyway, enough of my tangent. In short, to me, this take is so cold that it has freezer burn. Like, throw it away, put it in the trash, gone. In the bin. So in this part of the video, I very quickly want to do a wrap-up of the phases, or sections of the previous parts of the video. Just very quickly, very quick summary. So where have we been? I'm using a framework written by an authoritative source in order to inform my reading of Hama as an indigenous character, and not as a functional critique of anger at imperialism or colonialism, because it isn't a functional critique at all. There are a number of foundational flaws within the creation of her character, within her narrative, and in the way that she is presented as the villain, that create a lot of issues in reading this as a one-to-one critique, as the creators have stated that it is. Hama as a character is presented as an exaggerated caricature of indigenous anger, bitterness, and hatred created in the wake of colonization, and presents this reaction to the trauma caused by colonialism and imperialism as invalid, as though white people have any place to tell anyone how to react to anything, especially the violent destruction of their culture and their lives. The dichotomy between Hama and Katara's ethics and morals renders the idea that Avatar: The Last Airbender exists as a critique of colonialism structurally weak, because when you consider that the Water Tribe members are based on a real indigenous community who still faces extreme levels of violence and disenfranchisement and oppression, it just doesn't vibe, for lack of a better word. It simply doesn't make sense to create that dichotomy and then present it as though you are taking the moral high ground by making Katara the hero and Hama the villain. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And then the last part that I feel like I need to say something about this is that blaming victims of oppression for the violence that their oppressors have done to their community on a general scale, when they are an individual, is not a hot take. It's just colonial and imperial apologism. You need to wash your ass and see the facts for the facts. And that is that this character is positioned as the villain because of an inherently colonial and imperial gaze that is being put onto her, and put onto Katara for that matter, by the creators, who are two white men, presenting the series as though it is a full and fundamental and flawless critique of imperialism and colonialism. And it just frankly isn't. It just isn't. My final thoughts on this are, white people don't have the right to tell stories about Indigenous people and our trauma, because they will always find a way to make Indigenous people the cause of our own pain. Develop higher standards. Decolonize. Land back, bitch. Alright, so that is it for this video. This is going to be the first in a series of a few videos that I have created notes for in terms of media critique and narrative critique. I'm going to focus on some themes, some characters, some narrative arcs, all of that stuff in the future. So if you like what you saw here, feel free to take a look at my last video, which is the inaugural video of the Candy Indian Read series. And also leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, or hit the little bell thingy, I don't know where it is down there, yeah, for a notification when I upload another video. I'm hoping to make this a series of just media criticism that is focused on Avatar: The Last Airbender, because this was a huge part of my childhood. This is a huge part of the childhood of my entire generation of really super early millennials, or, you know, the very back end late millennials and super early Gen Z. And especially with it coming out on Netflix again, and with there being a new live-action movie made, I think that a lot of people are in this space where they want to consume it a little differently. They want to be a little more critical of it, and I love that. I absolutely love that, and I want to contribute. Yeah, so that's it. Next video should be up next week. Something like that. Alright, goodbye.